So my name's Allan Foster, and I want to talk a little bit about how this topic actually came to be. So a little bit about myself, right? I love to talk to people. So my day job is with ForgeRock, and I'm lucky enough to work with our partners, our technical partners around the world, largely dealing with problems that they're having, and I like to think of it as thought leadership kinds of issues and when we're focusing with customers. Aside from that, I'm also the president at Kentara and have been for 5 years now, something like that. And there's a lot of really interesting things coming out of Kentara. Yesterday we did some things with the consent receipt and UMA and various things like that. Another hat that I wear is on the board at ID Pro, where we are looking at the issues that are focusing specifically at identity professionals like ourselves. And in yet another hat, I'm on the board at the DIAC. And for those of you that haven't heard of the DIAC is the Digital Identity and Authentication Council of Canada, which is, I don't know, yet another group getting together to try and address digital identity. And here we have an entire conference focused on digital identity. So obviously we've still got a fair bit of things to talk about. So one of the things that has been coming up more and more as I go around to conferences, as we come to conferences like this, and as I talk to other identity professionals, is this issue about data. Toxic data or data that they need to store somehow, and what should they do? So I started thinking about this, and the presentation that I'm going to go through unfortunately doesn't have any nice, easy answers for us. But what I tried to capture was sort of the discussions that I've been having and some of the trends that I'm seeing around the world and the ways that we're sort of going into this. So first of all, let's talk about what I mean by toxic data, right? Initially, the conversation starts around PII, right? Personal identifying information. Unfortunately, that, I believe, is a slippery slope, because identifying information can be practically anything given enough granularity, right? There's a couple of articles that have come out around, you know, these tire sensors, the sensors that sense the pressure of the air in your tires. If those can go down to 2 decimal places of accuracy, it turns out that simply the tire pressures of your 4 tires of your vehicle is enough to uniquely identify that vehicle within a city. So really, what is PII, right? It sort of becomes pretty much anything if you can get enough vectors in order to go over those. So I'm sort of expanding that out into personal data. Data that is about us, data is about what we do, data is about who we are, that kind of information. There's also the aspect of that of sort of private data, not necessarily personal information, but information that we don't want to have shared. Could be our bank accounts, could be, I don't know, the trip record of where I fly during the year. It's not really personal information, but it's stuff that could be damaging to me if it gets exposed. And then there's the third one, which is just general transaction data when we're dealing with applications. Bank account information, all of this kind of stuff that is sort of really there by virtue of the service that we're getting offered. What happened? We went to a blue screen, and it's gone. So now I am officially standing between you and lunch. So hopefully we're going to get it up. So what I want to do when the next slide comes up, it'll back me up on this. What I want to have a look at is the issues around data toxicity through 3 different lenses, right? The lens of the consumer, the individual, us. The lens of the enterprise, I guess our businesses and companies that we end up dealing with there. And then the third one is looking at it through the lens of the community, of which we are all members. And each one of those, I've got some lovely diagrams. Where's the screen gone? have to press a button? No, I've got a clock running here with power. Aha. Black to blue screen. It's slowly focusing its way in. Okay, so we'll carry on and we'll have to look at the pretty pictures once these actually end up coming back. So from the perspective of the consumer, right, this is one that most of us are pretty comfortable with thinking about. Unfortunately, the consumer has absolutely no control over it, right? The challenges that we have from a consumer's perspective is we have the process of breaches. We put our data onto a website. We've got no control, we've got no visibility, and really that consumer's life can be quite negatively impacted if that personal data is breached or is used inappropriately. And the problem that we've got is that inappropriate use can come up from several different aspects. It can come up from the aspects of intentional inappropriate use, where, and I'll come to this when we start talking about the enterprise in a minute, but it can be intentional inappropriate use or unintentional, right? Somebody somewhere makes a mistake, and that ends up having our private information or personal information exposed for somebody to take advantage of, right? One of the there we go. So now I can show you my little man and the pretty pictures. So now we can move forward to this one here, right? So the potential for abuse for our consumer, right? First of all, we've got, and there's several sessions going on this week around privacy. And the immediate sort of solution to privacy is to say, well, we'll just get consent. I don't think so, right? The number of websites that I have been to in the last 3 weeks that end up saying, by the way, we collect your personal information, click OK if that's OK with you. I don't think that that's ultimately going to pass muster. Right? It's an interesting intermediate gap that's really designed by a lawyer to keep them sort of out of liability. But the reality about it is that as a consumer, it doesn't do anything to help me. Right? We all read around the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the processes there, where I would say that is actually an active threat where it was intentional use of the consumer's data. On the other hand, we've got this lack of control, loss of visibility, loss of even visibility into where our data is stored. I know I can't think of the places where my credit card information is actually stored. Can you? You can probably think of 5 of them. You can probably maybe even come up with 10 of them. But if you were to sit down now with a piece of paper and write down all of the places where you have stored your credit card, guarantee you'll miss at least one, and probably more than that. And so we don't have any visibility as to where that ends up happening. On the other side of that, the consumer themselves. I don't want to say that the consumer is remarkably stupid. I really don't want to say that, but the evidence seems to contraindicate that. The reality about it is that consumers don't know how this stuff works. My mom looks at her email address and she says, that's so that people can send me email. And that's what it's for. And she doesn't see the threat of putting her email address or putting her phone number into a website somewhere. And if a pop-up comes up on her screen that tells her she's got viruses and she needs to spend $20 to fix it, my mom is one of those people that would spend the $20, right? So our consumers shouldn't have to be smart in order to have that data protected from them. They want to shop. They go in and take their private information and fill it up with Facebook with stuff that most of us don't really want to see, right? And yet that's their private information and they put it up there. From a community perspective, right, changing views just a little bit when we look at it from a community side of view, we are all part of the community. And the problem with that is that we all do identity. So when you are caught at the airport, many of us who travel have been in the end of one of these lines, right? It's not that airport or that airplane or even that airline that you are angry with. It is air travel in general, right? And in the same way that a rising tide lifts all ships, a sinking tide strands them all, right? Every single time that we end up seeing one of these breaches that comes up in the news, it's us that ends up with egg on our face. Yes, that particular enterprise for a few days may have some PR problems and they'll be in the news for a while, and maybe even their CEO gets to go in front of a committee somewhere and say how sorry they are. But 3 months later, 6 months later, who really gets to pay that? And that's us, because the consumer's trust in what we can do goes down with the entire industry for every single one of those that ends up happening. And so really, this is all of our problem. It impacts every single one of us. And then the sort of third lens to look at this is that of the enterprise. And this is, in my mind, the easiest of the three. Because when we start looking at the enterprise, it is strictly about money. A friend of mine once told me a story of an alligator in Australia. And there was this wild park, and a trainer stands out with a fishing rod and a chicken hung off the end of the fishing rod. And he's got this alligator in the pond that's leaping up to eat the chicken. And they get through their act, and a young 12-year-old boy comes up to him and says, "Mr. Trainer, are you and the alligator friends?" And the trainer looks at him and he says, no, we're not. That's an alligator. What he does is eats things. And if I were in the same place as the chicken, he would eat me. And that is the enterprise, right? The enterprise, as much as we like to think that the enterprise has feelings, that the enterprise has morals, that the enterprise has good wishes and everything, it ultimately all ends up coming about revenue. And so it's actually pretty easy to try and predict what happens inside of the enterprise and what they end up dealing with. Inside of the enterprise, data is power. Collecting data, and we've gotten into this model now. I think this morning during the keynote we heard about the issues of big data. We're collecting lots and lots of data because it's in our nature, right? And the problem with that is, in my mind, the power part of that. Because some time back, we've all know this quote, right? What ends up happening is that as we get an imbalance in power, it ends up being corrupting. And all of us are in the situation where as we collect more data as the enterprise, we look at that data and say, how can we monetize this? How can we get more services? How can we turn this into more money? Even if it's a little bit privacy invading, the morals of it become less of an issue, and it's about chasing the money. The imbalance, and we've been fighting the imbalance for a long time, right? The individual and the consumer doesn't have much to say about it. However, they are the worst impacted if data is abused, both actively and passively. And so trying to get this sort of scale back into a little bit more normalcy, there's a bunch of things happening around the world, and this is where I don't have answers, but I have some observations about what we're looking at. First of all, we have Germany leading the GDPR, riding into the rescue to save us all. Right? The GDPR has done a bunch of really interesting things for us that defines a normalcy. Actually, a couple of years back at EIC, we came up with the term civilizing the internet. Right? We no longer drive through, even though those of you not from the West Coast think we still ride on horses and do cattle rustling and stuff. That's not the case, right? We've civilized it and we've got a new way of doing business. And part of what GDPR is trying to do is to change that scale just a little bit to make it a little more impactful to the enterprise. And the way that they've done that is, as we said earlier on, the enterprise is about money, the enterprise is about revenue, so let's hit them where it hurts. Because when the EU when GDPR puts in fines of $20 million or 4% of global turnover, those are big numbers. What that actually does, the fine raises that up into visibility at the board level. This now becomes an existential threat to the organization. And it's one that the CFO and the board ends up looking at and saying, hey, are we doing any of that? Are we exposed to these risks? So GDPR is helping along that, and it's doing some really cool stuff around causing people to look at what they do with data. However, I think it's just the beginning. And some observations about what we end up looking at on that is we are going to move more and more into requirements on enterprises to actually show for all of the data that they have, where they got it from, the terms under which they got it, and if it required consent, or what the terms were that enabled them to use that data for those specific terms. What this leads to, unfortunately, is a whole lot of baggage that comes along with data. We've got one little row or one little entry in our database, and this much metadata that we have to keep track of saying, this is when we collected it, and here was the consent and terms that we got for that for these particular purposes. I got into a discussion about this where what happens if you have the same piece of data that is collected under multiple consent directives, right? You got some that was under this path and some on a different application. Is consent, is it the union of the consent? Are they different usages? I don't know. We haven't looked at that. At the moment, we're still looking at putting up a sign about we use cookies and we accept your data. But more and more, if we are accepting personal information, we're going to have to come to the reality that there is a lot of metadata that we're going to have to carry around with that. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but inside of our enterprises, it is, because we don't know where that data goes. We know that that system takes some information and puts it over here and some information over there, but simply keeping track of how information moves, how personal information moves inside of our enterprises is actually a really hard job, right? So we are still going to have to keep some kind of personal data. And the discussion has led up as, what kinds of businesses are there? There's probably more than this, but these are sort of the three that in the discussions are sort of broken down into. The first set is using personal data as an actual business model. Obviously, Facebook jumps to mind, but there's others as well. The second one is using personal data secondary to their actual primary business model. It's used as a validator for identity, typically banking, financial institutions, medical, these kinds of things fall under that realm. And then the third one is utilizing personal data just because we need to get some attributes, which in my mind is probably the majority of the kind of SaaS applications that we run with on the net. Facebook, these kinds of businesses where collecting the data is their business. I don't know what's going to happen there, but I think it's going to be bad, right? I think that ultimately what's going to happen is they are going to start seeing regulation that begins to look like the kinds of regulations that we have on financial services and on healthcare, things like HIPAA and things like that, because they are actually monetizing real personal information and utilizing that. And it's Facebook, it's Google, it's LinkedIn, it's all of these kinds of services. Financial services is a little bit more interesting because they have regulatory requirements, KYC, AML, things like that, where they've really got to know the identity of their customer. But that's not their business, right? Their business is actually being a bank, and they have significant regulation that they have to do inside of that. They also have significant identity proofing capabilities, which I'll come back to in just a second. And then the third one is our general SaaS applications. And they end up keeping transaction data, but really, do they need to keep that heavy identity data and that identity proofing? So some of the things that are happening around the world, I don't like the term IDPs because I think it covers too much. In reality, we can break down into authentication providers, attribute providers, and proofing providers. Looking at those, we're already using providers to do authentication, right? Anybody goes to, I mean, almost every website you go to now, there's a button there that says log in via Facebook or log in via Google. A lot of the websites you go to log in via Amazon. So we're already using them to provide these authentication services. Proofing, well, we're already using those. Not so much in the US, but globally, government is beginning to provide actual identity proofing services. We're seeing this in the UK with UK Verify. New Zealand has a program. Canada is working towards a program. So several governments, actually even Singapore has a program around that, where governments can provide high-value identity proofing. Or coming back to those financial services, right? They have significant regulations which are unlikely to change. And so they can do a lot of that proofing. And then there's attribute providers. And we don't see a lot of these. It's sort of just beginning to show up. So we're starting to see some in Canada. Canada has a couple of really interesting ideas where individual providers can provide some form of attribute as an assertion about you. Yes, you have a bank account at this bank. Yes, this is your mobile phone number. Yes, you are a resident of such and such a state. Utilizing these assertions may give us a really interesting way of being able to get away from storing information in our systems, and thereby having to manage that information. A little bit about self-sovereign, because this is one of the ones that, what about if the user brings their own data? And there's half a dozen different companies that are working around this personal data and the user bringing their own. And I think the challenge that we've got there is one of trust. The enterprise doesn't necessarily trust how the end user got that information, and they cannot explain the full provenance of how that information actually worked, and so they don't want to accept it. There's some interesting work being done now around verified claims, where the user is able to present the claim, but the claim is actually from some other service provider that can actually be verified. Interestingly, the technology here is already in existence. This is not a technology problem. We have solutions for that. The real problem here is trying to get the business to accept a very different way of doing business, having the end user bringing their data up to the table. I think also that identity is becoming, and it was interesting watching the keynote this morning where we were talking about core competencies. Identity is becoming a core competency, and I think what we're going to start seeing is providers whose only job is to provide identity services, to provide attributes, to provide assertions, proofing, or authentication that the rest of us can simply use in most cases. And so one of the things that we can go into, right, if you don't need the information for a specific use case, you probably shouldn't have it. You probably shouldn't be storing it. This is different than utilizing it for a transaction. If you need it for the transaction, absolutely, utilize it. But if you're going to store it, right, you need to know why you're storing it and why you have it for the long term. From an engineering perspective, from a geek perspective, our default position should be no. We don't store that. You've got to convince me why we should. And that goes against our grain, because we like storing stuff, right? We've always been taught, store all you can because information is power. We should ask ourselves these kinds of questions. Why can we not rely on an external authenticator? We want to do it all ourselves, but why can't we rely on external authentication? Can we trust them? And I think we can more and more with different kinds of authenticators. What about external attributes? Definitely external proofing, right? There's an awful lot of identity information that we can go out, lowering our own risk of having this information by going out to providers who are focused and making that their core competency. The data that we do have, this sort of comes back from GDPR, right? Say what you're going to do with it, and then do what you said. This is about the transparency to our end users so they know what you are actually doing with that data. So those are sort of some of the observations that I've seen around a movement away from organizations wanting to do everything themselves, and believe me, we all do, right? We all want to be able to manage identities, but are beginning to move away at the direction of executive management, who are looking at that and saying, hang on a minute, that's a significant risk to the business. Can we lower the risk by going out and buying that service from enterprises that are going to take on that risk because that becomes their core competency? I encourage you to look around the world. We've got very different stages of maturity in different markets around the world. Canada's doing some interesting stuff with this. Australia's doing some interesting stuff. Europe is doing some interesting stuff around offloading these identities off to dedicated IDPs. So with that, I think it's time for lunch. So thank you very much, and if there's any questions. That really means you want to go to lunch, right? Okay, let's go to lunch. I'll be around for the whole conference if anybody wants to have the conversation. And I encourage you to continue this kind of conversation with your colleagues and other people here.